Welcome to another episode of Real People, Real Stories, where we provide you with compelling tales from everyday people just like you. I'm your host, John Wendell Adams, author of the novels Betrayal and PayBack, along with the soon-to-be-released novel, Ruthless. You can always find me by going to john@johnwendelladams.com. So for the next 23 minutes, let's get to today's guest.
Helping the immigrant, the widow, the orphan, all those things that are faith values of mine.
Sure.
I started to practice the law, helping those types of people.
How you doing, man?
I'm well. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, I'm so glad you could come hang out with us today. I have been looking forward to this for quite a while. Shoot, it's been a while since, with all the things that are going on around the country, around the world, I haven't seen you face to face, but do me a favor, just give me, name, where you're located, in the country, etc. Do that for me, would you?
Yeah, of course, John. So I'm Marqus Cole, and I am in the suburbs of Atlanta, in Snellville, Georgia, and have been here for about almost 4 years now since leaving Chicago. And I'm here joined with my wife, Amanda, and our two daughters, Ava and Isabella, who are 6 and 3. So it's been a while, but yeah,
Holy
we got down here and spread out a little bit.
They do grow up, right?
They do. It happens fast.
Yeah. So before we start to talk about your compelling story, which to me is pretty amazing, tell me, if you would please, what it is that you do right now.
That's a great question. Hard question to answer because sometimes it feels like I wear a bunch of different hats professionally. But what I would say, John, is that everything that I do is kind of connected by the same thought or the same kind of vocational call, you might say. And that's really, as I've started to describe it, as revealing shalom. And what that means for me is that I'm just wired up and made up in such a way that I like to go into broken places or broken spaces or meet with people and help them understand a better way to do things, a better way to make decisions, or a better way to run organizations and institutions. And so I really do get that blessing to do that. Now I do that with the tools of a lawyer, of a community organizer. I know we'll get to some of this, some ministry tools that are in that toolbox as well. But the base of everything I do is really stepping into places that are in crisis, or maybe not even crisis, just spaces where things can be optimized and made better, and just kind of put on my problem solver hat and say, hey, how can we go after this together?
Thank you for that. One of the things that as I really sort of dug into what's going on for you, Marqus, and what I've known about you for years, is you've made this interesting transition, and we're going to talk about that. The interesting transition from the law practice to this thing that you're doing in the global community. Tell me a little bit about your law practice and what you did exactly. Just help me with that.
And so maybe it might even be helpful to frame it out that the practice of law that I've done for almost a decade now, really, I view it more as tools, right? And you'll hear me say this throughout our conversation. There are tools in my toolbox, and sometimes I use other ones, and sometimes I use different ones. For me, going to law school was all about this observation I made pretty early in my life that, hey, here's a problem. Folks that look like me or have similar life experiences to me tend to have these issues, whether it's criminal justice issues or other things. And importantly, I don't see very many people that look like me practicing the law. So how do I solve that? And so I went to law school with that idea of public interest. Really, how do I help folks? And so when I graduated law school, my first job really was just as what they call a legal services attorney, which is fancy for just saying when folks are in crisis and need an attorney and can't afford an attorney, you can go to these different places around the country and folks will help you with housing issues, education issues, public benefits issues. And so it really aligned with my faith values of helping the immigrant, the widow, the orphan, all those things that are faith values of mine. Sure. I started to practice the law, helping those types of people, and then made some transitions along the way we can talk about.
Got it. So fulfilling for you?
I would say very fulfilling. The legal practice is one of the few areas of life where your job day in and day out is meeting with people in their need, right? And so the way I was taught by a mentor to think about it is, every person usually only talks to a lawyer when something's happened, right? Something's in their
Yeah,
family
right.
or something criminal or bankruptcy or whatever it is. And so for that person, the thing you're helping them with is probably the most important thing in their life in that moment, in that season. But as the lawyer, you're helping 30, 40, 50 people. And so it's fulfilling in the sense that you get to help all these folks. But there's also the shadow side, which is if you overinvest yourself into it and you start carrying other people's stuff, it can lead to burnout. And we're going to talk about that, I'm sure, when I talked about some of that transition I made, but just kind of what that life cycle is for someone that's always in that crisis mode.
Got it. And so, in spite of the fact that it was fulfilling for you and helping people and giving them a purpose for the struggles that they were having or helping them through the struggles that they were having, you made the transition away from law to this, what I call the global community. What was some of the motivating factors for why it is that you did that? And really, what came first?
Wonderful question. And as we're recording today, you might even know that the now late Archbishop Desmond Tutu passed away recently. And there's a quote attributed to him that I think was very profound. And it's around this idea of walking by a river every day and you dive in to save someone and you rescue them. But day after day, you're doing that. Eventually, you have to start asking who's pushing all these people in the river, right? And so my practice of law transitioned from that legal services, helping people in immediate crisis, to asking this question after several years of why are so many people at this intersection of poverty and criminality and lack of resources and homelessness and all these issues. And one of the things I saw was that there was an element to the system just not working for them, or maybe built to work against them. And so I transitioned from legal services to doing some criminal justice reform, working as a prosecutor. And then after that, and you may remember part of this story, John, I stepped away from the legal practice almost completely to run for US Congress for a bit. And again, the idea was always the same, to move further and further upriver and just ask this question, why are people constantly in crisis? And so as that race, that campaign for US Congress kind of came to its natural conclusion with me not being a congressperson, I found that there was a space for a person like me that had strong faith values to enter into the civic space, organize around those values, and seek policy change, right? So it was never about politics, but it was always about policy. And so your question is, how did you make that transition? The transition was actually a natural one, an organic one of saying, there's a value for saving people, helping them in crisis, but there's also a need to change policies.
Well, and this whole thing about policy change, I mean, you know, so many individuals that have gone into the political space, right? The public sector have done that with an eye on looking at policy and making policy changes. And yet we all know that, you know, depending on which side of the aisle you're on, it's really very difficult. And yet, I have to give it up to you for your altruistic desires to really make a difference. And when I think about it, you know, when I say this thing about the global community, you've moved into two different places. This thing of the Evangelical Environment Network, and this thing that you're doing really now at the Grace Snellville Church, both as a director and a community pastor and such. This has to be where you think there's the opportunity for being able to impact people's lives. So in the one sense, there's the policy changes, right? And then there's the other sense of being able to get sort of down and dirty, helping people in the space where they are. So talk about that, would you?
Something you said is really important. Lots of folks have entered into the public arena, the civic space area, seeking policy change. And I think it's a valuable thing. It's something obviously I look for as well. But if all it were policy change, I think there would be something missing. And I think we see that throughout human history. If all we do is change who's in charge in that kind of space, we never, things get better, but they're not quite what they could be. And
Sure.
again, that's where that faith value steps in. And the work I do at the Evangelical Environmental Network and at my local church, I think provides that second hand, right? Which is not just policy change, but life change. And a lot of that discipleship. And so it's not the suggestion that only policy will fix everything, but there really is a kingdom value of living our lives differently, transformed lives. And I like how author Esau McCaulley talks about it in his book, Reading While Black. He says this: if the resurrection is true and the Christian stakes his or her entire existence on its truthfulness, then our peaceful witness testifies to a new and better way of being human that transcends the endless cycle of violence. And so I just think for me, I think there's value in stepping into the public arena to change policy, but I could only do that and sustain that because there's something else underneath that motivating me, right? It's a different way of living your life and seeing life. And that's kind of what we do at EEN that I'd love to share more about.
I guess the question that has to be asked and answered is, how are you impacting people's lives today? What does that look like? How is it that you're able to, with the synergies, I would imagine, between these two things that you're doing with EEN and being a community pastor, how are you able to now impact lives really at the base level?
It goes back to, what I said about that vocational call a couple of minutes ago. And this idea, to me, I've started to call revealing shalom, right? And that word shalom, I know, is a fancy word that we don't use very often in conversation, but really it's about more than just kind of peace, rest, or justice. It's this fullness of things being in right relationship. Right. And so the idea of revealing that is to say that, I'm not, you're not, we certainly aren't creating that ultimate peace where we're not like doing it or working at it, but it is there to be uncovered if you know how to find it and where to find it. What that means practically, though, is really stepping into institutions or communities and saying, how can we together go after change? How do we provide hope in these different contexts? And for me, that looks like, in the secular world, we kind of call it mentoring or community organizing, global organizing. I think another word to use, a maybe older word, is discipleship. Just this idea of walking alongside people, helping them, find a better way to live, whatever that different calling is, and then helping them help other people do that they come into contact with.
Gosh, kind of paying it forward, if you will. I like that. I like that concept. So you mentor, and then you raise up people, and then they go mentor, and it just continues in that regard. Do me a favor, if you would, Marqus. Just help to make the plane land here. I mean, we've been talking about this really at about 5,000 or 10,000 feet. We can see the ground, but help me to make the plane land. Give me an example or examples of where you've been able to impact individuals' lives in a given situation, and how that's played out for them, and how it's really just given you the thing that you really desire in all of this, your desired outcomes.
I'll talk about my friend Joel. He shared his story before, and I feel comfortable sharing his story.
Sure.
Joel is a gentleman that lives in the Midwest. He's a normal guy like you and I, nothing super special or fancy, except for he has this opportunity and role on his local city council, right? So we're not talking DC, we're not talking state capital. He's a local city council guy in his city. And he connected with us at the EEN through our book club, and he's been in community with us for a while. And he signed up for what we call our partners program, which is really a kind of in-depth training. We walk through some scripture and the science and some community organizing around creation care. And what Joel would say of himself, and has said of himself, is that he is a lifelong Republican. His grandparents were Republicans, his parents were Republicans, but he's a person of faith. And so what he discovered at EEN was a way to get past the politics and see how his faith values can impact policy. And the reason I like sharing Joel's story, and he likes sharing his story, is because for him, being a part of the creation care movement allowed him to kind of get past some of the stuff you hear on the news or cable news or what you see on social media.
Sure,
And
sure.
he's done things like talk to his congressperson, right? He's written op-eds or letters to the editor. And importantly, in his sphere of influence as the city councilman, he made a pitch for his city council to put solar panels on the top of their city hall, not because he's like a hippie or anything like that, but because they have strong values around like taking care of economics, right? Like they wanted to be good stewards of their resources. And they found that by putting solar panels on the city hall, they could reduce the amount they were paying every month for utilities and electricity. And that's money that they could steward better in their local city. And
Got
so,
it.
he went with this proposal. The city hall passed a proposal. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, they didn't have the resources in that season to go through with the installation. But this is a guy who never thought he'd be that guy to talk about those things and go after
Got
those
it.
challenges. But just through being in community and really opening his eyes to the fact that anyone can be involved in this at any level of influence, it was just a great story of how, as he said, I never thought that was for me, but I realized that I could do this and I can
Got
do
it.
this. I have done this.
As the current expression is, I didn't want to be that guy. I didn't think I'd be that guy. And yet Joel apparently has been. So
Yeah.
this is a guy that you've had the opportunity to walk alongside and really mentor. And you talk about this faith aspect that has apparently played a significant role in what it is that you end up doing. This EEN seems to me that is a faith-based organization predicated on its name. And obviously the thing that you're doing with Grace Church in your neighborhood is another faith-based organization or construct, if you will. But those two things together, it seems like there's some synergies associated with that. Talk about that.
You use the word synergy. That's a good word. I think on harder days, I might use the word tension. There's a tension that
Okay. All right.
right. We talked about EEN, right, which has the word evangelical and environmental right next to each other. And I know a lot of folks, those two words maybe shouldn't sit beside each other, or there's some tension in them sitting beside each other. And for those that are kind of listening, but maybe not aware, I'm a millennial, yes, but an older millennial, African American. I live in the South, but I work at an evangelical church on staff, and I obviously work for EEN. And so for some folks, there's a tension there as well of like, wait, what? And so what I would say about those synergies, though, is that I think in our culture here in America, we're at an interesting inflection point where if we're going to be united, it's not going to be through uniformity, right? Like if we're going to come together as a community, it's not because we all look the same or talk the same or even think the same. The unity is going to have to come in shared values. And so one of the things that both the job at EEN and the local congregation allows is for me to be a natural bridge person, to say to some people on one side, hey, we share this faith value around loving our neighbor, around, life in a full and abundant life, and what that means, of caring for one another, caring for creation. And to my friends and neighbors on the other side that maybe don't share those values under that name, or maybe wouldn't name it that way, we can talk about, you used the word altruism earlier. Hey, what does it mean to just be a good person? What does it mean to live a moral life? What does it mean to use resources we have and share those resources well with other people? And so I think if we're going to be united in this country, in this season, this age, we have to have bridge people. We have to have folks that are willing to say, well, I'm not this tribe or that tribe. I'm something else. I'm something in between. And again, all of my work is rooted in my faith values that I think, I don't want to lay it on too strong, but I think the kingdom that I'm called to is one that is united, but diverse. It has different people in it at the end of that story, and they're using different languages, and they're doing different things. but they're all united in their goal of what they're doing and who they're worshiping. And I think that for me is the value and the key that I look for.
Well, Marcus, I love what you've just articulated. There's an expression that I use a lot, particularly when you talk about bridge building, is when you are communicating with people that are not necessarily specifically aligned with you. The question I always ask is, am I trying to make a point or build a bridge?
Yeah.
And that to me is one. And the second thing is that this is what I'm hearing you say is you're really trying to align with people that are diverse and really trying to find places where you can be, in effect, united around a particular cause or some aspect, and really not trying to say, well, we're exactly the same, but in fact, we do have common values, common interests, common desires. And so I love what you've just articulated. And I guess the thing that really prompted me to want to talk with you is you've made a significant, I think it's 3 steps, if I think about it, from the legal practice to this thing of policy changing and the run for Congress, and then this thing that you're doing now associated with what I typify as really this global community and what you're doing really on the ground with people that are different. The thing that I would ask you is, if you had the opportunity to talk to someone one-on-one or in a group situation, to talk to them about career change, because that's what you've done, what would be some of the things that you would communicate? What would be the motivating factor for you? And what might you say to someone else who's saying, hey, I'm in this role, right? This career track, but my heart is maybe someplace else. What would you say to them?
Oh, what a wonderful question. I think in kind of, where we're located in the West, in the philosophical tradition, you hear this thing called know thyself, right?
Yeah, sure.
In the faith community, we kind of talk about having an identity rooted in something deeper than just kind of other things. The way I would answer the question is, I have found through mentors, yourself included, that there is this idea that if we allow our quote unquote job or career to define who we are, then it really does limit and trap us. It prevents us from growing and trying new things, striking out and doing new things. And so what I would say to someone interested in a career change is to properly locate your identity. My identity has never been Marcus the lawyer. And I talked about this earlier. I love the law. I love the tools of the law, the way we think about the world, the way we tell stories as lawyers, the way we convince people, make points, as you said. But a lot of folks get trapped in the mindset that I can only do a job that is associated or connected to whatever, the degree I have or the training I have.
Right.
And so what I have pushed towards and try to disciple people into or mentor people into is, what are your giftings and skills? What's the unique way that you've been designed and made? What are your abilities? What are the things that you have passion for?
Yeah.
And once you discover those, where can you apply those, right? And so, yes, as a lawyer, I help people in crisis, jumped into that river, as I said earlier, but it's worth noting that the science community, even the business community, the military has said that climate change is a threat multiplier, right? That severe drought, food shortages, heat waves, pollution in water, like all these things make life harder, not just in the global South, but here in America as well. And so we're at a crisis moment. There's no real debate about that part of it anymore.
Yeah, that's right.
So when you step back and look at what I do in that frame, then what I've done is said, hey, here's a crisis. I have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. And if we keep on this track, when they're 36 and then 37, they're going to be in a worse situation than I'm in. How do I help prevent that, right? And so, yeah, there's some policy change stuff that needs to happen, but also there's some heart change stuff that needs to happen with friends like Joel in the Midwest or other people I have at the local congregation here in suburban Atlanta, where I have to help bridge them past the kind of political conversations they're used to having to more around these value conversations, right? Like no matter where you fall on spectrums, most people tend to value their children and their grandchildren. They want a better
Yeah.
life for children and
Yep.
grandchildren than the life they had. And so let's talk about those values, right? Most people, when they sit down at the kitchen table to do their bills, don't like writing a check to the utility company. So let's talk about that, right? As the gas is climbing at the pump every week, you don't want to pay that money. Let's talk about a different way you could drive car, or a different way you can get to work that doesn't
Sure.
involve the gas pump.
Sure.
So there are shared values we have where we never have to talk about politics as the defining feature. We can talk about values as their defining feature. And so in that way, for the person looking for the career change, I would say, what's your vocational calling? What are your gifting? What are your skills? And then take a step back and say, how can I apply those?
That answer is so rich. And I guess if I had to distill it down to, it is a question, it seems to me, of really looking at what you're really good at and what you really like. And that's that aspect of passion. And then really taking a look at, well, who am I in this bigger world, right? And so the thing that I'm hearing you say for anyone who is looking at a career change, or maybe is trying to figure out how they broaden themselves within their career, is to really look at those things they really enjoy and the things that they're good at, and then looking at how they fit into the broader space. I think that for every person, whether they're, I don't know, just coming out of college or getting to the end of their career, I think those questions have to be asked and answered to determine, hey, what's the next thing for me? I love what you had to say about that.
One of my mentors, spiritual mentors, he says it like this when he walks through this with people. He says, there are a lot of things you could do. What's the one thing you must do or you have to do? That's such a clarifying question for, in the season of life that I've gone through. And I think for most people going through this global pandemic, this reconciliation moment, we see clearly there are a lot of things we could do. What's the one thing we have to do? Like, we're burdened for it, as Dave talks about it. And I love that word. Like, what burdens me at night? For me, it's leaving a world that's worse for my daughters than it was for me, right? And it's not to say that I can change the world. It's not my place. Again, my faith values are such that that ultimate kind of peace and restoration and reconciliation I'm looking for is one that will come much later. But that doesn't mean I check out now, right? It does call me to love my neighbor, to help the person in need now. And so that burdens me. And so that's why I've stepped into, my work the way I do.
As we come to the end of our time together, I'm reminded of a person that was in a meeting that I attended not long ago. And what she said was, things are so much in trouble. And when I look at all of the aspects associated with these troubling things for me, and she talked about climate change, she talked about racial issues and tensions and such, and, just the global pandemic, and went on and on. She said, I just feel like, there's not much I can do. And I'm only a person of one. So maybe I should just stop now. It should, let somebody else do it. And the point is, somebody else made, they said, often it's only that one thing that one person does that fits into this broader tapestry. And together we impact the life that we all are living. And it has some aspects associated with change. And I think what I'm hearing you say is, hey, at the end of the day, it may seem like I'm one person, but I'm taking the initiative to make the place that I am a better place once it is that I leave for in your case, for your daughters.
I think that's exactly it, right? It's the difference between, the fancy word is nihilism and hope, right? Like I have a hope that our impact, the things that we do, make a difference in people's lives. Like, not some future time when, I'm a ghost on a cloud playing a guitar, but like right now, like, it helps. Like it helps. I have a hope that I can impact people's lives right now. And together, if enough of us are hopeful in making those changes, that we can impact people at larger and larger scales. And the last thing I'll leave you with, John, just kind of from my job at EEN, but also my job at the local congregation, is that oftentimes I feel compelled to remind people that when we talk about systems or government or, these big things, institutions, companies, all we're really talking about are organizations of people, right? Like that ultimately, whether you're a congregation of 500 or a small business of 100 or a company of 500, you're talking about people that are organized around values, goals, and objectives.
Sure.
And that we all know, like that's a family, right? That's what your family is, are people organized around value, whether it's, a blood relation or a legal relation or experience. Like, we are all relational beings. And so the idea that I could just check out on crisis, check out on problems and say, well, there's nothing for me to do, actually flies in the face of all of our experiences, whether you live in America, you live in Asia. Like, we are all relational beings. And so I just want to call people listening to us today back to that reminder that what you do matters. It matters to the people around you, and what we all do together matters. So don't give up on organizations. Don't give up on politics. Don't give up on the civic space. Don't give up on organized people, because we're all relational. And as long as we're organizing around shared values, common goals of helping one another, we can, I have that hope that we can make that change.
Right. Well, Marqus, I have to tell you, I really have enjoyed our time together. I'm going to end up asking you to consider coming back as you continue this trek and you have more stories to tell and things to communicate associated with the work that you're doing. I think it's really great. I really do. I thank you so much for making the decision to come be a guest on our show. And like I said, I'm going to ask you to come back at another time.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure to, just share my story as a real person here. I just loved it. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. Well, listen, have a great day and we'll talk soon.
You as well. Bye.
You can always find me by going to john@johnwendelladams.com.